But Kerry says, turned out there were no protests at all. The Dayton Army was capable of repressing even any expression of sympathy for Palestinians under Israeli attack. And that shows that maybe Israel has a legitimate partner for peace at last, and we should therefore proceed to support such progressive policies as an indigenized army trained by the U.S. with Jordanian and Israeli help that can even go so far as to repress even an expression of sympathy while the U.S. and Israel are carrying out massive atrocities. This is the progressive position in the United States. I won't talk about the rest of the spectrum. Of course, Israel, while breaking up the cantons so that they become separated from one another and pretty much unlivable, more or less like the Bantustans. In fact, in many respects, worse than the Bantustans, because as that quote explained about South African history, white South nationalists needed the black population. That's the labor force. Israel would be delighted to get rid of the Palestinian population. They don't want to have any responsibility for them at all. If they can disappear, that's fine. So therefore, they don't even have to take the few steps that South African nationalists did to try to make the homelands viable. Of course, South Africa tried to get the Bantustans homelands recognized internationally, but that didn't work at all. In fact, I think the only country that recognized them was Israel, recognizing this is even before the conquest of the West Bank and Gaza. Well, U.S.-Israeli policy is not satisfied with breaking up the West Bank into cantons along the lines that the World Bank described. It's also specifically designed to separate the West Bank from Gaza, the other part of Palestine, repressing any sign of sympathy for Gazans by force is one illustration of that policy. This is, of course, in violation of international agreements, but the title of one of the books that Ian mentioned deals with that question. It's called Rogue States. When a country is openly and proudly in violation of international law and norms like our country, it just doesn't matter what international agreements are. They're irrelevant, not just in this case. Gaza itself is being very consciously strangled so that nothing beyond bare survival is possible. You don't want to let it go beyond that, or there might be an international outcry, but as long as the animals stay alive, it's okay. This is all being done with the cooperation of the Egyptian dictatorship, just as the colonial stance of the occupation of the West Bank is carried out with the Jordanian dictatorship, both of them close U.S. allies. Both of them fear independent nationalism and democracy in Palestine, in fact, anywhere in the Arab world, just as the U.S. and Israel do. This is a continuation of long-standing U.S. policy, which has long been directed to giving the most possible, strongest possible support to brutal dictatorships and centers of radical Islamic fundamentalism, and remains so. So the most important ally of the United States in the region, Saudi Arabia, is far and away the most extreme repressive state in the region, and is also the center of jihadism, radical Islamic jihadism. It's not just a coincidence that the people who bombed in 9/11 were almost all from Saudi Arabia, and that Osama bin Laden himself is. In fact, Saudi Arabia, with U.S. support and British support, the British has supported radical Islamic fundamentalism for years. That's the source of the radical Islamization of Pakistan under the worst of the Pakistani dictators, all of them supported by the U.S., Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s, Reagan's special friend, who with Saudi economic and other aid and strong U.S. support, carried out the radical Islamization of Pakistan, spreading madrasas over the country, encouraging jihadism and so on, all with our support, strong support. And that's been a characteristic pattern for both the traditional imperial powers, the United States and Britain, and for good reasons. The threat in the region is independent nationalism, what's called radical nationalism. Radical is just a word for independent, because that's exactly what might undermine imperial control. Radical Islamic fundamentalism and jihadism and so on may be a little bit of a nuisance, but they're not serious threats to control of the region, which is essential, and has always been recognized to be for decades, since the First World War, in fact, when oil was discovered, and before that for other reasons. Well, what the World Bank described really shouldn't surprise anyone who's familiar with recent history since 1967, since the conquest of the territories, because what the World Bank described is just a continuation of perfectly open policies, not concealed policies, which are designed to that end. Actually, it was expressed quite well by Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister in 1967 and responsible for the occupied territories. He explained that we should tell the Palestinians, we should make it clear to the Palestinians in the territories that we have nothing to offer them. They will live like dogs, and whoever leaves will leave. And we'll see where that leads. By now, plenty have left. Probably the majority of the Christian Arab population, much of those who are capable of leaving, who have the means to, just don't want to live like dogs, and know that that's the way they're going to live, because that's the U.S.-Israeli policy. And that's what's happened. The detailed plans have changed from one government to another, but the general picture has remained quite stable. Of course, this is carried. Diana is banking. He then and his successors have been banking on U.S. support, and so far it's been unflagging, almost unflagging. If you look closely, there are some interesting exceptions, which are pretty revealing. So, for example, in the mid-1970s, this is under Yitzhak Rabin, the peacemaker, Israel began to develop a town east of Jerusalem. Jerusalem doesn't mean Jerusalem anymore. It means some huge area, Greater Jerusalem, which incorporates Jerusalem as a small part. Incidentally, everything that Israel does in Jerusalem is doubly illegal. It's in violation of international law, like everything else in the territories, but it's also in violation of explicit Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. in fact supported. This is back in the late 60s when the U.S. was still part of the world on this issue. I'll talk about that. But there's a vastly expanded area called Jerusalem, which Israel is essentially annexed. And to the east of it, the Rabin government began to establish a town, Ma'ale Adumim, and the idea was to bisect the West Bank. If you look at the map, this town, Ma'ale Adumim, which now exists, tens of thousands of people, its borders extend almost to Jericho, which means essentially bisecting the West Bank. There are a couple of other salients in the north which break up the rest of the territory. Now, in order to develop Ma'ale Adumim, of course, they had to kick out the population. They're gone. Actually, by now, I suppose they're completely gone. The last time I was there in 1997, they were still living in tin huts up in the hills and so on. But that's unproblematic. Certainly it's unproblematic for a country like the United States, which is based on not just dispossession of the indigenous population, but extermination of them. Settler colonialism is far and away the most extreme sadistic form of imperialism for pretty obvious reasons. Our own history is a perfect example. However, what Israel wants to do is to close up, to bisect the West Bank properly, is to settle the region, a short distance between Greater Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim. It's a corridor called E1, and they want to build there, and then you have it broken up completely. But for whatever reason, the U.S. didn't want them to build there. And when the U.S. gives instructions, Israel follows. That's the way the world works. The world works pretty much like the mafia. There's a Don, namely us, and when the Don says something, you do it or else, or you're in trouble.